They say that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, but sometimes history's really complicated, which makes it difficult to determine, well, what lesson should actually be learned from a series of events. Fortunately, historians have figured out a solution to this problem. If the reality of a situation is just a bit too vague or complex, just make some shit up to support whatever narrative it is you're trying to spread, and if that fails, you can just make up an entire story wholesale. I mean, why not? You gotta get that point across. That said, most of the apocryphal stories that we're going to be looking at today have at least some basis in fact, even if the truth of the matter was obscured for thousands of years. Let's get into it. Caligula is one of the most famous Roman senators of all time, but not because he was any good. While Caligula was claimed to be a generous and fair leader in his early years, that didn't last. It wasn't long before he became increasingly self-indulgent, cruel, and sadistic. Most of the stories of Caligula paint him as a terrible and potentially insane leader, most famously illustrated by appointing his favorite horse, Incitatus, as the senator. According to the legend, Incitatus lived in a marble stable, was waited on hand and hoof by numerous servants, and was fed oats mixed with gold flakes. Not only is it said that Caligula appointed his horse to the Senate, but also that he made Incitatus a priest. However, while it is often repeated that Caligula did make his horse a senator, that never actually happens. That's not to say he never claimed that he intended to, just that he never actually went through with it. It's certainly possible that Caligula may have joked about appointing Incitatus to the Senate as a way to mock the senators, implying that they were so useless that a horse could have done their job. While the story was historically used to showcase Caligula's growing insanity, modern scholars tend to believe he was just being a bit of a dick. Although there is another possibility which is related to our next entry. In 39 AD, Caligula decided that he was going to invade Britain to cement his legacy as a military leader on par with Julius and Augustus Caesar. Setting the bar pretty high there, aren't we, lad? He assembled an army in modern-day France, but things didn't go very smoothly. Actually, things didn't go at all. For months, troops were kept at the ready, but they had no clear instructions. Caligula's orders were confusing, erratic, and didn't appear to be working toward any particular objective. Things got so bad that the soldiers nearly mutinied before ever going into battle. The original plan, as best anyone could determine, was to cross the English Channel in boats, then disembark and begin the invasion. Once the potential mutiny had calmed down, what happened instead was Caligula marched the army to the English Channel, declared war against Neptune, the Roman god of the sea, and had the army stab the water with their weapons, followed by having them collect seashells as trophies of war. The most popular interpretations of this were either that Caligula was insane, or that he was so feared that when he came back with all of the seashells and declared his triumph in the non-existent war against the sea, the Roman populace just kind of went along with it because they were afraid of him.
Nobody move a muscle.
A more modern interpretation is that following the near mutiny, Caligula decided to humiliate the soldiers by making them collect seashells like children, as that was all the soldiers were good for. However, those are the interpretations that assume this actually happens, and, well, there's a good chance that it just didn't. Even though every contemporary source agrees that Caligula was a brutal and probably insane leader, it's worth remembering that the contemporary historians were also all enemies of Caligula. Some were his direct political enemies, while others were merely writing under new leadership that vehemently opposed Caligula's reign, making them kind of his enemies by default. The sources in which the story appears were also written decades after Caligula's death, further increasing the chance that this was all just some made-up shit from the aristocracy who wanted revenge against Caligula for his constant humiliation of the Senate. Remember the horse thing?
I am the Senate.
What? I've never heard of this one. When you hear the name Pythagoras, the first thing that probably comes to mind is Pythagorean theorem involving the sides of a right-angled triangle. Indeed, I remember a maths poster on the wall in my classroom growing up. There are a couple of reasons that this is the only thing people seem to know about Pythagoras. The first is because very little is known about Pythagoras. He didn't actually write anything himself, with all his teachings being passed down orally. The other reason is that everything we know about Pythagoras, besides the triangle stuff, is really rather weird. You see, Pythagoras was the founder of the Pythagorean Brotherhood, a communal religious compound in the city of Croton. Basically, it was a cult with very strict rules for membership. If someone violated any of the rules, they would be expelled from the Brotherhood forever, and there would be a mock funeral to mark their death in the eyes of the Brotherhood. The rules and beliefs of the Pythagorean Brotherhood range from the relatively mundane to the downright insane. Pythagoras believed in reincarnation, so he and his followers were required to adhere to a fully vegetarian diet. After all, you'd hate to slaughter a chicken for dinner only to find out that that delicious chicken was a reincarnation of someone you loved. However, Pythagoras also believed that beans contained human souls, so eating beans was strictly forbidden as well. What the fuck, Pythagoras? Anyway, following the Croton victory over the neighboring colony of Sybaris in 510 BC, some of Croton's prominent citizens wanted to set up a democratic constitution for the city. This might come as a shock, but Pythagoras, the cult leader, was somewhat opposed to democracy because he felt the general population were just too stupid to know what was good for them.
I don't like the kid, but he's got a point, Jim.
He instead believed in having an elite ruling class, so the Pythagorean Brotherhood rejected the constitution. This ultimately led to his death when the pro-democracy faction rallied together to burn Pythagoras' compound to the ground. That much is all true. Wow. Beans with human souls in them, huh, Pythagoras? Really? But there are about a dozen different conflicting stories of exactly how he died. In the most famous version of the story, Pythagoras escaped the fire and fled from an angry mob only to run up against a field of fava beans. Not wanting to destroy a bunch of human souls by running through the field, Pythagoras simply stopped in his tracks and accepted his death at the hand of his pursuers. While we can't say for sure how Pythagoras died that day, we can be pretty sure that it didn't involve a field of beans. An ancient source did claim something like this happened, but the writer was speaking of other Pythagoreans who died in such a manner years later, not of Pythagoras himself. The story eventually got attached to Pythagoras' death, and it became popular because it was the most outrageous of all the different renditions. Everyone knows that the Spartans were unequaled in war. This is admittedly a bit ironic, seeing as their most well-known battle is one that the Spartans lost, but they still did really well, being outnumbered as much as 40-1. Regardless, Spartan society was largely built around training for combat. In order to officially become a Spartan citizen, boys had to go through a process known as a Gogh from the ages of 7 through 21. Naturally, this program involved a lot of military training and hunting, though it also taught dancing, singing, and rhetoric, which is nice, but mostly military training and hunting. The dedication to producing the most capable warriors didn't end with training either. There was a lot of rudimentary eugenics taking place as well. Unlike in the rest of Greece, Spartan girls and women were required to exercise and train as well, though they trained for sport rather than combat. It was believed that women should be as fit as the men so that they could produce the most fit offspring possible. Marriages were often arranged based on wealth and status, though that status was largely based on physical strength. This resulted in specifically breeding the strongest men against the strongest women in the hope of having the strongest babies. And while men and women typically got married when they were 18 to 20 and to someone of that same age, you would sometimes get older men marrying girls much younger than them, like in other Greek cities. However, in the event that an older Spartan man had a younger wife, it was his civil obligation to pick a younger man to impregnate her instead of doing it himself. Got cocked. So with all the emphasis on producing the most physically capable children possible, what happened if something went wrong? Well, according to the Greek historian Plutarch in Life of Lycurgus, newborn babies were taken to a group of elders for inspection. If the child was strong and healthy, it would be given back to the father to raise into a warrior. If it was sick, weak, or deformed, the baby would be tossed into a chasm on Mount Taygetos, known as the Apothetai, or deposits. It's an intense story and one that certainly aligns with common depictions of life in Sparta. However, Plutarch is the sole source for such a practice existing, which doesn't exactly bode well for the veracity of the claim, since he wrote about it some 500 years after it would have taken place. Other more contemporary authors did discuss some of the eugenic practices in Sparta, but selective infanticide, that wasn't one of them. Also, archaeologists actually found the specific site that the Spartans referred to. While they did excavate a large amount of human remains from the chasm, all of the remains were adults, not children or infants. It's believed this chasm was where criminals and traitors were deposited, not babies. And now we get to the quintessential tale of Roman excess. As the story goes, by the latter period of ancient Rome, it was common for wealthy people to have a room adjacent to their dining room known as the vomitorium. People would eat a huge feast, adjourn to the vomitorium to empty their stomachs, and then immediately begin another feast. OG bulimia. Even though this has been debunked numerous times, the myth continues to live on. Most of you watching this probably learned this in school, and there are likely still schools teaching this false history. In reality, a vomitorium was a passageway beneath the seats of a stadium or amphitheater that would allow crowds to quickly spew forth or vomit out of the arena. So how did a stadium structure get linked to the wealthy elite vomiting every meal so that they could eat more? Well, the mistake potentially goes back 200 years, and there is slightly more to it than someone just seeing the word vomitorium and guessing what it must have meant. As it turns out, there are a lot of stories about Romans vomiting in the historical record. This was most often done as a form of medical treatment, though there are stories of people gorging themselves at banquets to the point of throwing up, as well as tales of people vomiting during orgies. Alright then. However, outside of its use in medicine, it was never suggested that this was commonplace. These stories were usually meant to show the personal, moral failings of the person in question, something seen as outrageous and inappropriate behavior, rather than just being considered a sign of the times. Ah yes, Lucas Maximus is constantly vomiting at those orgies, like a beast. There is a famous quote from Seneca the Younger in which he stated, "They vomit so they can eat, and they eat so they can vomit." Likely confused matters as well. But Seneca wasn't a historian, he was a philosopher and a satirist. As someone who believed humans needed only the most basic foods to survive, Seneca meant this as a harsh criticism of people who indulged themselves with exotic foods, not as a literal account of commonplace Roman customs. But given that quote, in combination with the large number of stories of Romans eating to excess, it's easy to see how everything could have got jumbled up along the way. It still doesn't explain how vomiting and orgies became intertwined, suffice to say, they were doing that wrong. It's been said countless times that history is written by the winners, but in this case, history was written before the fighting was even done. Set to the tune of the Colonel Bogey March. Oh, hi-ho, hi-ho. I didn't even know that's what it was called. A song you would definitely recognize even if you don't know it by name. British soldiers in World War II took to singing the following disparaging lyrics about the German leader. Hitler has only got one ball, Goering has got two but very small, Himmler is rather similar, but poor old Goebbels has got no balls at all. Wow, when I was a kid it was Hitler's only got one ball, the other's in the Albert Hall. Just me? The song quickly spread from the British forces to the rest of the Allied forces, as well as among civilians. And just to be clear, I didn't grow up during the Second World War. I don't know why this was, like, a tune that I would know. It was even featured in the movie The Bridge on the River Kwai. This was all just meant as a bit of childish propaganda, which is probably why the song continued to live on British schoolyards until the early 1980s or so. And again, no, I was born in the 1980s. 87, baby. It was in the 90s this still lived on.
Susan, chill out.
Somewhere along the way, however, the song began being interpreted as a historical fact. While some argued that Hitler was only born with a single testicle, the more common story is that he lost one of his balls in a shrapnel blast in World War I. It is true that Hitler's thigh was injured by shrapnel during the war, but all credible evidence suggests that Hitler's ballsack was unharmed during this incident. On multiple occasions, people claimed to find medical proof that Hitler had only one ball, but seeing as one source claimed a testicle was lost in the shrapnel blast, another claimed he was only born with a single testicle, and yet another claimed that he had two balls, but only one ever descended, it's fair to assume that these sources might not be credible. On the topic of Hitler, another famous story is that he was actually of Jewish ancestry. A lot of people during World War II and since then have emphasized the irony that Hitler did not appear to be Aryan, at least as many people understood it. According to Nazi law, Aryans were any non-Jewish people of European descent, which did include Hitler, but the idealized vision of Aryans that Hitler consistently pushed was that of tall, pale-skinned people with blue eyes and blonde hair. By contrast, Hitler had dark hair and was only of average height. While it would be easy to think that the story that Hitler was part Jewish was a follow-up to the more visually obvious disparity between Hitler's appearance and the idealized Aryan, an additional rumor meant to further discredit him, the Jewish rumors actually began much earlier. They also originated in Germany, not from the Allies. Hitler began proselytizing about the importance of racial purity in the early 1920s, but there was something that he hadn't considered while making these speeches. His father was a bastard. To this day, we have absolutely no idea who Hitler's paternal grandfather was, and since he was preaching about racial purity, this gap in his lineage was a glaring weakness that Hitler's political rivals in Germany felt they could use to discredit him. Now, it obviously didn't work, but the idea that Hitler was part Jewish has persisted ever since. The claim was even repeated by Hitler's lawyer turned Governor General of occupied Poland, Hans Frank. During the Nuremberg trials, Frank claimed that Hitler's grandmother was knocked up by the teenage son of the Jewish family she had been hired to cook for in the city of Graz. But this claim is considered extremely unlikely, as the Jewish population had already been driven out of Graz long before Hitler's father would have been conceived. In 855, following the death of Pope Leo IV, a new pope was elected. Pope John VIII was a highly respected and ingenious man with an intellect rivaled by no one else in Rome, making him the clear choice for the role. It wasn't until 1857, just over 2 years into the reign of Pope John VIII, that his true identity was finally revealed. During a papal procession from St. Peter's Basilica to the Lateran, Pope John Paul VIII suddenly gave birth to a child, accidentally revealing her identity as not Pope John, but Pope Joan.
Oh my God! Okay, it's happening! Everybody stay calm!
What's the procedure, everyone? What's the procedure?
Stay calm!
Some versions of the story claim that she was murdered for her deception, but others state that she died of natural causes. Either way, she is said to have died shortly after giving birth, with no mention of the fate of the child. To be fair, there was only a 50% chance the baby would have lived to its 5th birthday back then anyway. Holy shit, the past. Because of the embarrassment of having elected a female pope, the Vatican destroyed all mentions of Pope Joan from their official records. And while this is a little fun story that was taught as fact for centuries, there is no evidence that any of this ever happened. And it's not because of a secret Vatican cover-up. The first mention of Pope Joan didn't come until about 400 years after the events were alleged to have taken place. Although Joan's story was quickly adopted as fact and taught for about 300 years, it was eventually dismissed as being purely fiction. Even if the Vatican had removed Pope Joan from their official records, there should still have been some mention of her somewhere in the historical record. But there was nothing until the story first appeared in the 1250s with no source material. It's also worth noting that despite being described as having unrivaled skill and intellect, Pope Joan isn't cited as having done anything during her 2-year reign. There were no church reforms, no theological works, and no political acts. This would have been highly unusual for any pope, let alone one who was supposed to be so exceptional, providing further evidence that Pope Joan was just a work of fiction. There is perhaps no person in all of history more entertaining than Diogenes the Cynic. Diogenes was a well-known and respected philosopher while also being a public nuisance, notorious for his criticism of politicians, philosophers, and other public figures, criticism which Diogenes told these people directly to their faces with a biting wit. He was also homeless by choice, instead opting to live near the market in a large ceramic jar that had once been used to store food. And oh yes, he was a prolific public masturbator because, apparently, why not? Because of what an outrageous character he was, Diogenes has been the subject of many apocryphal, or at least exaggerated stories. In one such story, Diogenes was traveling by boat to Aegina, but the boat was captured by pirates, with the passengers being sold into slavery on Crete. One by one, the captives were placed on the auction block and instructed to tell the potential buyers their skills so that they could be purchased to fill jobs that they were suited for. When it was Diogenes' turn, the auctioneer asked him what he was skilled at, to which Diogenes replied, "Governing men." He then spotted a wealthy-looking man in the crowd and told the auctioneer, "Sell me to him, he needs a master." The man apparently agreed because he purchased Diogenes, not to be his master, but to tutor his children. While this story is generally regarded as fiction, one contemporary account of Diogenes' death stated that those children he tutored arranged his burial, though his personal wish was just to be thrown over the city wall for the wild animals to eat. About 15 years before the previous story took place, Alexander the Great became king of Macedon. He quickly began by eliminating rivals and consolidating power, and he went on to conquer almost the entire known world. Just a year after his campaign began, Alexander had already made immense progress in his consolidation of power. He stopped by Corinth, where he was greeted by politicians and philosophers who offered him praise and congratulations. He expected that Diogenes, who was known to be in Corinth at the time, would have come to meet him as well, but he did not. Instead, Alexander went out to find Diogenes himself. Alexander found him sunbathing, so he approached and asked if there was anything the wise philosopher wanted. Diogenes replied, "Yes, stand a little out of my sun, much to the amusement of Alexander's entourage. As Alexander and his men walked away, he was reported to say, "If I were not Alexander, I would like to be Diogenes." While this is an amusing story that really highlights Diogenes' disregard for wealth, authority, and decorum, it is unlikely to have ever happened. This story spawned centuries worth of literary and artistic works, and the factual, historical relationship between Alexander and Diogenes has been heavily debated. But the oldest known telling of this story was written by Plutarch roughly 400 years after it would have happened, calling into question its historicity. Our next story goes back to biblical times despite not actually appearing in the Bible. There was a Jewish tradesman, likely a shoemaker, who was a disciple of Jesus. Or maybe it was Pontius Pilate's doorman. There are a lot of versions of this story with about a dozen different names for the man. Regardless of his occupation, this man had been a disciple of Jesus up until the point of crucifixion. But when it was time for Jesus to carry his cross to the crucifixion, the man turned on him. During the forced march, the disciple taunted, insulted, and possibly struck Jesus. And that much might be true. Following his arrest, Jesus' disciples abandoned him, running away out of fear that they might face similar punishment. There was a large crowd following Jesus to the crucifixion, mocking him and potentially getting violent, so it is not inconceivable that one of those in attendance might have been a former disciple. It's what allegedly happened after that shifted into the realm of pure fantasy. As the story goes, Jesus, who was famously bitter and vengeful, cursed the man with immortality, forcing him to wander the earth until Jesus' second coming. Although the story of the Wandering Jew was taught as fact at various points throughout history, really, it's got an immortal man in the story. That's not real.
I beg your pardon? God damn.
There doesn't seem to be any basis for it. The story is an amalgam of various parts of the Bible, such as Cain being cursed to wander the earth, that was largely used to vilify the Jewish population and portray them as being collectively responsible for Jesus' death. Speaking of religious stories that are often treated as fact despite not making sense, there's the tale of Saint Denis, the most famous cephalophore in Christianity. Cephalophore is just a fancy word for a saint who was martyred by decapitation. Well, can't believe there's actually a specific word for that. There are a number of these saints in Christianity, apparently enough to justify creating a new word, there we go, just to describe them, and artistic depictions of them usually show the saint carrying their own head. That's a useful artistic shorthand for depicting the saint's cause of death, but in the case of Saint Denis, the story became a bit too literal. Saint Denis, known as Denis of Paris, was the first bishop of Paris sometime in the 3rd century AD. He had been sent from Italy to Gaul to convert the people to Christianity, and he was really good at it. He was too good at it. The pagan priests noticed a sharp decline in their followers, which they reported to the Roman governor. The governor in turn tracked down Denis, and 2 of his missionaries took them to the top of the highest hill, known as the Montmartre, and decapitated them. Denis then picked up his head and walked for miles, continuing to preach a sermon as he walked. Once the sermon was completed, Denis's body collapsed at the site, where the Basilica of St. Denis was later constructed. The overall story of St. Denis as the Bishop of Paris who was executed by the Romans, that's true, and we hopefully don't have to explain where the famous tale veers into fiction. While most Christians have always understood that the story was metaphorical, there has always been a segment of the population that has treated this story as historical fact. He carried his own severed head for miles, guys. It's not real. The 1860 poem Paul Revere's Ride by Henry Longfellow immortalized the story of Paul Revere's midnight ride in American history. Lookouts were going to hang lanterns in Boston's North Church to signal how the British were approaching, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. Once Revere saw the 2 lanterns, he got on his horse and heroically rode from Boston to Concord shouting, "The British are coming," giving the American militia time to prepare their offensive. This story has been taught in schools for well over a century, but Longfellow's poem was deliberately inaccurate to create a more concise and heroic tale, creating a legendary figure that people could rally behind. In reality, shouting, "The British are coming," would have been a terrible plan. The colonists were still British citizens, many of them still loyal to Britain, so it would have been a confusing and entirely too overt message. Revere's real message was, the regulars are coming, something that was only passed along in secret to the heads of militias and other people important to planning the sneak attack against the British military. There was also a network of about 40 total riders that night, and Revere never made it to Concord. He was captured in an army roadblock and interrogated at gunpoint, at which point he told the British everything the colonists had planned. Revere's interrogators released him and went to warn the army column that had arrived that night of the colonists' plans, but the British army was apparently unimpressed. They still attempted to carry out their plans, late-night raid of weapon stores, but instead of seizing weapons and arresting key leaders of the colonists, the British marched right into the first battle of the American Revolution. If you look up Victorian in the dictionary, you get a bunch of self-referential statements that aren't terribly helpful, stuff like relating to the Victorian era. But if you look up prude in the dictionary, you'll see that Victorian is listed as a synonym. The Victorian era is known for being very sexually repressed, and as the monarch, Queen Victoria became the symbol for that attitude. She's even cited as giving women the advice, "Close your eyes and think of England," for their wedding nights. But Victoria never said such a thing, nor did Prime Minister Baldwin or his wife, to whom the quote is often sometimes attributed. Instead, Victoria described her wedding night sex as the happiest moment of her life, and she very much enjoyed having sex with her husband on a regular basis. Go Queen Victoria! Her personal letters not only describe how much she liked banging her husband, but they were filled with dirty jokes as well. The prudishness of the era actually originated with the church and the middle class, who sought social reforms based on modesty and sexual repression. The Contagious Diseases Prevention Act of 1864, enacted due to sexually transmitted diseases running rampant through the military, also played a role here. While there were restrictions, sex work was legal at the time. But after the Contagious Diseases Act was passed, police had the authority to detain any sex worker and inspect their genitals for signs of infection. There was no strict definition of what constituted a sex worker, though, so police could invasively inspect any woman that they wanted, and if they believed she had an STD, she'd be locked in hospital for 3 months. Past everybody. This didn't eliminate sex workers, but it drove them underground, where they wouldn't be harassed by the police. The once public industry now had to operate in the shadows like a criminal enterprise, even though what they were doing was actually legal. This crackdown on sex work was one of the many societal changes during the era that made the population appear more repressed, even if Victoria wasn't the one initiating these changes. There is perhaps no story from ancient times more famous than that of the Trojan horse. As a refresher, in case it's been a while, the Trojan War had been going on for about 10 years, with Troy under siege by the Greeks. After a decade of failing to make any progress, they came up with a plan to trick the Trojans. The Greeks constructed a large wooden horse inside which they had 30 or 40 of their best soldiers. The horse was left as a gift to the Trojans, sort of a "sorry we spent the last 10 years attacking your city" thing, while the Greeks boarded their ships and sailed away. With the Greeks believed to be gone, the Trojans opened the gate and brought the horse inside their city walls as a victory trophy. That night, under the cover of darkness, the soldiers escaped from the belly of the horse and opened the city gates for the Greek troops, whose ships had returned. With the Greeks inside the city walls, the war was soon over. Not only is this story famous, but the term Trojan horse has been used in modern times to describe everything from computer viruses and spies to grocery store loss leaders. But did any of it actually happen? The truth is, we don't know. For at least 1,000 years, this was all treated as historical fact. Then it was believed that the Trojan War never happened and Troy was never a real place. And then in the 1800s, they located what they believed to be the city of Troy. Today, the Trojan War and Trojan horse are often taught as historical fact again, but there isn't any archaeological evidence to suggest the horse ever really existed. To be fair though, professional archaeologists are very meticulous and careful with their excavations, while Troy was excavated by a self-taught amateur using an irresponsible amount of dynamite. Even if the Trojan horse had been real, there's a reasonable chance that all of the evidence has been destroyed. Realistically though, even if the Trojan War happened, there was probably never a literal wooden horse. The only extant accounts of the Trojan horse came from epic poems written hundreds of years later, and it's likely that their descriptions were based on a several hundred-year-long game of telephone in which people were trying to describe an early siege engine without ever seeing one. On July 2nd, 1954, a landlady knocked on a tenant's door at 8 a.m. to deliver a telegram. There was no answer, and the doorknob was too hot to touch, so she called the fire department. Inside the smoke-filled apartment, firefighters found the remains of Mary Reeser in the center of the room. All that remained was part of her spine, her skull, which may or may not have been dramatically shrunken in size, and her left foot, which was still wearing a slipper. The rest of her body had been reduced to ash, and as was the chair she was sitting in, though nothing else in the apartment was burned. The heat from the flames had caused nearby plastic to warp and candles to melt, but nothing else had caught fire. Police were stumped, and the police chief called it the most unusual case I've seen during my almost 25 years of police work in the city of St. Petersburg. But finally, a theory emerged. Mary had been the victim of spontaneous human combustion. This became the most widely circulated account of events, and her case is commonly cited by believers in spontaneous human combustion. Of course, while this is the most popular explanation for what happened, there is a much simpler answer. Mary was an overweight smoker, and she habitually took sleeping pills at night to help her rest. It is believed that she started smoking a cigarette after taking her pills, but fell asleep before finishing. The cigarette then fell in her lap, igniting her nightgown, and her fat allowed her body to burn like a candle throughout the night. The reason the fire didn't spread was because the floor was cement and her chair was in the center of the room, too isolated to cause anything else flammable to ignite. In 1638, Galileo published his Law of Falling Bodies. About 2,000 years earlier, Aristotle had claimed that heavier objects fell faster than lighter ones, and this was largely treated as fact for the next 1700 years or so. A Byzantine philosopher in the 6th century, John Philoponus, openly criticized Aristotle's theory, but his ideas didn't gain any traction. It wasn't until the 14th century that people really began questioning Aristotle. There were radical ideas about motion involving uniform acceleration, and the maths seemed to suggest that Aristotle's basic principle of heavier things fall faster was actually pretty wrong. But for reasons unknown, nobody bothered to test this new theory experimentally for some 100 years. It wasn't until the late 1500s that Galileo famously went to the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa to drop two spheres of drastically different masses. While Galileo did recognize that different objects fell at different speeds, he attributed this to friction in the form of air resistance based on their shape. But by using two objects of the same shape but different weight, he believed their acceleration would be the same, and thus the two spheres would hit the ground at the same time, which, of course, they did. Or at least that's what people have been led to believe, particularly thanks to this experiment being relayed by one of Galileo's students. However, this almost certainly never happened. To start, the story places Galileo's experiment between 1589 and 1592. This was decades after two other Italians had already performed this experiment and disproved Aristotle. Obviously, it is important for scientists to replicate experiments to verify the results, but there was no reason for Galileo to have performed this experiment again so many years after it had already been performed and successfully repeated. There's also no mention of such an experiment in any of Galileo's work, and using one of Italy's most famous landmarks to perform a science experiment is probably the sort of thing that he would have written down, right? It is believed that Galileo had described this to his students as a thought experiment rather than genuinely performing the experiment himself. Since others had already shown that objects of different weights hit the ground at the same time when dropped from a great height, Galileo could have just dropped some balls off the roof of a house to demonstrate the idea to his students. There was no need for him to perform such a grandiose version of the experiment, and no evidence in his work that he ever did. Although there was some amount of debate, for thousands of years it was accepted that the Sun and other planets revolved around a stationary Earth. There was occasional pushback against this, but geocentricity was the way the people liked it. Then in 1543, Copernicus published his book on a heliocentric model of the solar system to surprisingly little controversy. Not only did high-ranking members of the Catholic Church encourage Copernicus to publish his work, the book was even dedicated to Pope Paul III, though this may have been done in the hopes of preventing retaliation. The problem with Copernicus's work was that it was too complicated for anybody but the most educated astronomers to read. It was also a purely mathematical model explaining how a heliocentric solar system would work, not a declaration that this model was in fact the one that the world was in. But once the telescope was invented and Galileo began making observations that supported the idea of a heliocentric solar system, things didn't go so well. It was one thing for Copernicus to write a complicated book nobody could understand, but it was a very different thing for Galileo to look through a telescope and ask, if everything is supposed to revolve around the Earth, why can I see moons orbiting Jupiter? Suddenly the church took notice, and things did not go well. Galileo had run afoul of the Inquisition, and that led to him being arrested, convicted of heresy, and sentenced to life in prison. Or so it's said, and while that's close to the truth, it's not quite what happened. To start, Galileo was never convicted of heresy. He was found vehemently suspect of heresy. That was still serious in nature, as his work was very much leaning in the direction of heresy, but Galileo was not officially considered a heretic. As for his sentence, this has been heavily exaggerated by painters and authors who were sympathetic towards Galileo. Many paintings and plays from around that period depict Galileo behind bars in a dimly lit dungeon cell, playing up both the cruelty of the Inquisition and the portrayal of Galileo as a victim. However, his punishment was not nearly so severe. Though he was technically sentenced to life in prison by the Inquisition, Pope Paul V immediately commuted Galileo's sentence to house arrest instead, and he was still allowed to have visitors and conduct research. He just couldn't publish his new work on heliocentrism. Even the lead up to the trial was pretty nice for Galileo. By law, he should have been forced to stay in the Inquisition prison while awaiting trial, but instead he was allowed to stay at the Tuscan embassy in Rome. After the trial, he even got to spend a few days at the Archduke of Tuscany's private villa in Rome before being placed under house arrest. The restrictions placed on Galileo's work and publishing weren't ideal for a scientist, but it was hardly the horrific Inquisition prison cell in which his final years were usually depicted. And oh yes, when it came time for Galileo to publish his final book, he just sent the manuscript to a printer in Holland, where they didn't care about the Inquisition very much. It's hard to imagine the President of the United States' involvement in an event being an afterthought, especially with all the modern Secret Service protocols for presidential appearances. But according to one of the most famous stories about Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, that's precisely why he had to write the speech on the back of an envelope while riding a train to the ceremony. The purpose of the event was a formal dedication of a national cemetery that was built on the site where the Battle of Gettysburg took place, and the dedication speech was being given by Edward Everett, an elder statesman and the most famous and well-respected orator of the day. Originally, Lincoln wasn't even scheduled to speak, which was why he had to write his speech so hastily. Lincoln had been invited last minute to take the stage and make a few appropriate remarks that have been forever immortalized in American history. The style at the time was to give long, magniloquent speeches, which was why Everett spoke for about 2 hours. By comparison, Lincoln's speech was only 271 words, the same number of words as this entry about it, to give a sense of how long he spoke for. And he used direct and straightforward language that resonated better with ordinary people. This made Lincoln's speeches feel more honest and heartfelt, which helped lend credibility to the idea that the speech had been scribbled down on the train earlier in the day. In reality, however, Lincoln spent a long time working on that speech, and there were 5 drafts of it dating back over 4 months. It's well known that Vincent van Gogh, or Van Gogh, if you prefer Americans, never received any level of fame during his lifetime, and he survived primarily thanks to the support of his younger brother, Theo, a well-respected art dealer. In fact, it's usually stated that Vincent only sold a single painting during his lifetime. But that's not entirely accurate. Vincent wasn't comfortable leeching off his brother, so he suggested that he give Theo some number of paintings each month in exchange for the financial support, and Theo could keep whatever money was made off the sale of those paintings. Holy shit, Theo should have held on to that. The only one of those paintings to sell during Vincent's lifetime was The Red Vineyard, sold to a Belgian art collector, Anna Boch, in 1890. But while Theo was a professional art dealer who would have kept meticulous records of his sales, Vincent was not. And Vincent did personally make many sales, at least in a manner of speaking. Throughout his life, especially in his earlier years, Vincent was known to exchange his paintings for food, rent, and art supplies. These weren't cash sales, but he was still receiving things of monetary value in exchange for his paintings. Legally, and for tax purposes, non-cash sales do indeed still count as sales, and even without that specific legal definition, it would be hard to argue that Vincent never sold any of his paintings. That said, we don't really know what paintings Vincent sold or to whom, because he wasn't concerned with keeping those records. And we can't just assume that all his paintings that weren't sold by Theo's widow must have been paintings Vincent had sold for food and art supplies, because he's well known to have also given paintings away as gifts, sometimes to the same people he had sold paintings to in the past. So while The Red Vineyard is the only painting of Vincent that can be specifically identified as having been sold during his lifetime, it is far from the only painting that he ever sold. Do you or a loved one suffer from chaplainitis? I mean, probably not, but in the 1910s, this term was actually used to describe the unparalleled popularity of actor Charlie Chaplin. According to a newspaper article from 1918, actress Mary Pickford had attended a dinner event in London. She and Charlie were the two biggest stars in Hollywood, so they ran in the same circles, and the following year, they and two others founded the film company United Artists. So, if Mary told a story about Charlie, there was reason to believe it. Anyway, according to the newspapers, it was at dinner in London that Mary told Lord Desborough that Charlie saw a Charlie Chaplin impersonator competition while at the fair, and he decided to enter it for a laugh. Out of 40 contestants, Charlie came in 20th place. Of course, after Mary told this anecdote to Lord Desborough, he then told it to the press. So even if the printed article was to be believed, it was a third-hand account. Regardless, the story spread like wildfire. It was the perfect story, and it was repeatedly printed in newspapers, journals, and other media. For decades, it was treated as established fact. And it wasn't until 1960, when Charlie Chaplin Jr. wrote his book, My Father Charlie Chaplin, that the record was finally set straight. Charlie Jr. mentioned the famous story in his book, but he clarified that Charlie had come in third place, not 20th. However, Charlie Jr.'s version of events contradicted the original story. He claimed the contest had taken place before he was born, but also that it took place at a theatre that wasn't built until after he was born. Charlie Jr. also set the date of the contest a full decade after the story had originally appeared in newspapers. And so, in an interview 6 years later, Charlie Sr. set the record straight, for real this time. In short, no version of this story ever happened. Charlie was the biggest star in Hollywood and had helped found a film company. He already worked hard all day, so the last thing he wanted to do in his free time was go on stage and compete for a $25 prize. There are a lot of popular stories about Winston Churchill, but perhaps the most commonly repeated story on the internet is that Churchill was born 2 months premature in a bathroom while his mother was attending a dance. Part of that might be true, part of it is a misinterpretation, and part of it is almost certainly a scandalous cover-up. The contemporary accounts of Churchill's birth don't contain a lot of details, largely describing it as normal and uneventful, aside from being 2 months premature. What we do know is that Churchill was born in a small bedroom in Blenheim Palace, and that his mother attended the St Andrew's Ball there the day before she gave birth. It is theoretically possible that she started going into labor during the dance, but she didn't give birth until over 24 hours later, long after the ball had ended and everybody had gone home. As for being born in a bathroom, this seems to be a misinterpretation of events. It was said that Churchill was born in a cloakroom, a room or closet used for storing coats and such during an event. Cloakroom was also a common euphemism at the time for the bathroom. Kinda still is. Like, maybe old people say it a bit more, but you could still say that in the UK and you'd be understood. However, for the event in question, it is believed that the bedroom closet to the ballroom was being used to store people's coats. For the purpose of the dance, it was a makeshift cloakroom, but it was still an ordinary bedroom, not a closet or bathroom. And with regards to Churchill being born 2 months premature, I mean, sure he was. His parents' wedding was perceived as being somewhat rushed, without the level of fanfare and publicity one would have expected for a high society wedding. The groom's parents didn't even attend. Though there's no way to know for sure, many historians are of the opinion that the rushed wedding was indicative of Churchill's mother already being pregnant before she got married. The word sapphic comes from the Greek poet Sappho, and it was used to describe sexual attraction or activities between two women. The more commonly used term, lesbian, also came from Sappho, as she was from the Isle of Lesbos. While little of Sappho's poetry has survived, contemporary sources state that she primarily wrote about love, specifically sexual love between women. This is supported by her surviving work, though it's not entirely explicit. And yet, despite Sappho being so synonymous with female homosexuality that she became the origin for multiple words used to describe it, she is claimed to have killed herself over the unrequited love of a man. According to the story, Sappho fell in love with the legendary ferryman Phaon, and by legendary, we don't mean he was a well-known and respected ferryman. He was a mythical character who never actually existed. Regardless, Sappho fell in love with him, and they had sex, but he quickly grew tired of her. Heartbroken over being rejected, Sappho threw herself off the Lucidian cliffs, ending her own life. It's possible that the mythical Phaon was used in this story as a stand-in for some random dude who wasn't famous enough to be written into the Athenian plays, but it's believed that this entire account of Sappho's death is actually just pure fiction. Historians believe that the story of her death was constructed to convince ancient audiences that Sappho was heterosexual, and because women's lives weren't generally regarded as being important to the historical record, no alternate account of her death was ever presented in ancient sources. Democritus was one of the most prolific philosophers of ancient Greece, having written over 70 books. Unfortunately, none of the works survive to this day. We only know of his philosophy thanks to second-hand accounts and quotations from his work that other philosophers included in their books. But if he wrote so many books that were widely circulated and reproduced, where'd they all go? According to one version of events, Plato had them all burned. Plato and Democritus had diametrically opposed beliefs, and Plato thought the proliferation of Democritus's work could be damaging to society because of how incorrect it was. For example, Plato believed the universe was composed of forms, eternal ideals that were the unchanging blueprints of the universe. A tree wasn't a tree because of some material structure, but rather because it borrowed its treeness from the immaterial essence of nature. And it was only by understanding these immaterial forms that people could gain knowledge of the universe, not by focusing on their material representations. Democritus, on the other hand, had this outrageous idea that the universe was made up of invisible particles called atoms. Outrageous. Everyone knows it's about treeness. He felt that the physical characteristics of everything were determined by its atomic composition, and that behavioral characteristics were derivative of those physical characteristics. Perhaps the most dangerous part of this theory was that it removed the need for divine powers to exist in order to explain the universe, instead arguing that all knowledge of the world could be gained through observation. However, while Plato despised Democritus's ideas and even claimed he wanted to have all of his books burned, a couple of other philosophers were able to talk Plato out of it. They argued that the books had been reproduced so many times and spread so far that trying to burn them all would just be a waste of time. The real reason none of Democritus's work survived was a combination of factors such as the fragility of documents from back then, the time and resources required to make new copies, and the declining popularity of atomism, making the preservation of those particular books a low priority. At the age of 20, Charlemagne began his reign as King of the Franks. By the time he was 52, he had united most of Western Europe, as well as Central Europe, and he was the first recognized emperor of the Western Roman Empire since its previous fall 3 centuries earlier. Charlemagne's reign was a pivotal moment in European history, as he began the Carolingian Renaissance, ushering the world from the early Middle Ages or Dark Ages to the Middle Medieval period. He was a firm believer in education, and he introduced educational reforms that would help spread literacy throughout the kingdom, at least among the clergy and aristocracy. And it's said that Charlemagne was such a big proponent of education because he was personally literate. This is only half true, though. It's true that Charlemagne was illiterate when he ascended to the throne, but he was heavily focused on learning and bettering himself. Rather than having jesters and musicians as entertainment at dinners, Charlemagne instead surrounded himself with scholars with whom he engaged in serious discussions and studying. Even though it's widely reported that Charlemagne never learned to read or write, his servant and biographer Einhard described him as being fluent in reading and speaking Greek and moderately capable at best in Latin. Charlemagne also tried his hardest to learn to write Greek, practicing on wax tablets he kept hidden under his pillow. Unfortunately, he never got any good at it. Reading and writing were considered different, almost unrelated skills at the time, so Charlemagne learned to read before attempting to learn to write. Because of this, he didn't attempt to learn to write until later in life, a fact which Einhard attributed to his lack of success. So Charlemagne wasn't fully illiterate as he was able to read and understand texts, but he never mastered the ability to write. St. Patrick was born in Roman-controlled Britain sometime around the 5th century, or maybe in the late 4th century. Although his father was a deacon and his grandfather was a priest, Patrick wasn't really a believer in Christianity. That all changed when he was kidnapped by pirates at the age of 16 and enslaved in Ireland for 6 years. During that time, Patrick turned to God, and he believed that God had facilitated his eventual escape and return back home. After returning home, Patrick eventually worked his way up to becoming a bishop, at which point he traveled back to Ireland to work as a missionary. According to the most famous story about St. Patrick, he went into the mountains to fast for 40 days, as Moses had done on Mount Sinai. During his fast, Patrick was attacked by snakes, so he chased all the snakes out to the ocean and drove them out of Ireland. He is sometimes credited with chasing demons out of Ireland as well, since the story says he was also attacked by a flock of demonic birds. Alright then. This story passes the most basic fact check, as there are indeed no snakes in Ireland. However, the absence of snakes in Ireland had already been documented about 200 years before Patrick was even born. This story also didn't emerge until hundreds of years after his death, with Patrick not mentioning snakes or a mountain fast in any of his writings. There are two main explanations for the origin of this story. The first is that the snakes were meant to represent pagans, and Patrick metaphorically drove them out of Ireland by spreading Christianity. But while he was extremely successful in his missionary work, converting the majority of the population was a multi-generational effort, not something Patrick accomplished by himself. A number of pagan traditions were also incorporated into Christianity to make it more appealing to pagan converts, so it wouldn't be fair to say that he drove paganism out of Ireland entirely. An alternative explanation is that people back then had absolutely no idea why there weren't snakes in Ireland. We now know it was too cold in Ireland for snakes to live during the last ice age, and when temperatures rose and glaciers melted, the rising ocean separated Ireland from mainland Europe before snakes had a chance to migrate back there. But like we said, people didn't know any of this 1400 years ago when the legend first began. In the absence of a scientific explanation for the lack of snakes, it's possible that their absence was credited to Patrick simply because he was the primary patron saint of Ireland. So, I mean, why not? American viewers may be less familiar with this story, but the British should be well aware of the most famous anecdote about Sir Francis Drake, the second person to circumnavigate the globe in a single expedition, and a man who got in on the ground floor of England's slave trade. Despite spending most of his life as an explorer and a privateer, Drake served as a vice-admiral in the war against the Spanish Armada in 1588. Note that Drake received his knighthood years earlier for work as a privateer, not for his service in the Navy. Anyway, Drake and his men were stationed at Plymouth Hoe on lookout for the Spanish Armada. To pass the time, they played a game of bowls, a type of lawn bowling. Drake was known to be a huge fan of bowling, so when the Spanish Armada was spotted approaching, he famously insisted that there was plenty of time to finish their game and still defeat the Spaniards. He lost the game of bowls, but the English were successful in their defense against the Spanish Armada, which was probably a bit more important. It's an entertaining show of bravado and the sort of behavior one might expect from someone who was essentially a pirate. However, despite this being the most repeated story about Drake, there's no evidence that any of it happened. There are no eyewitness accounts of this game of bowls in the historical record, and the earliest known telling of this story didn't appear until 37 years later. John Henry was an African-American freedman from sometime in the 1840s or 1850s. He worked as a steel driving man, someone who hammered steel drills into rocks. This was done during the construction of train tunnels so that holes could be filled with explosives and the rocks blasted away. It was hard work and there was no man better at it than John. But what about a machine? There were over 100 patents issued for mechanical drills between 1850 and 1870, and one day, one of these steam-powered drills rolled up to John's worksite. It's not really clear, or even important, whether or not John liked his job. What mattered was that it was his job, and damned if he was going to lose it to a machine. And so a challenge was issued, man versus machine, to see who was better for driving steel. There are a number of variations in how the contest is said to have played out, but the end result was always the same. John was able to win the race against the steam-powered drill, after which he immediately died of exhaustion while still clutching his hammer. The story is seen as a triumph of the American spirit, though triumph over what is kind of unclear. John's death proved that even if a human could be temporarily faster than a mechanical drill, it wasn't sustainable. And all of the steel drivers were replaced by machines despite John winning the race, so it's not really the feel-good story that people often treat it as. That all said, it's unclear how much of this is actually true. John Henry was a real person, but there were also multiple of them. One worked as a steel driver constructing the Big Bend Tunnel in West Virginia. The other was a convict who was lent out by the penitentiary to help work on the Lewis Tunnel, also in West Virginia. It's possible that either of these men could have been the John Henry of legend. The construction of both tunnels coincided with the introduction of the steam-powered drill, and it is known that men worked alongside machines to build the Lewis Tunnel, though there is no record of a steam drill being used at Big Bend Tunnel. Historians continue to search for more direct evidence of the race, but the fact that multiple John Henrys with the right job at the right time is enough to suggest this story is at least vaguely plausible, though almost certainly heavily dramatized. Vote early and vote often was a phrase popularized in 1850s America. Despite this phrase being meant as a joke, this practice may have resulted in the death of famed writer Edgar Allan Poe. What? On October the 3rd, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe was found on the streets of Baltimore, barely conscious and wearing somebody else's clothes. It was an election day, and his body was found outside a tavern that was near several polling locations. According to the stranger that stumbled upon Poe's body, he was in great distress, in need of immediate assistance. Poe was rushed to the nearby Washington Medical College, but he was never able to remain conscious long enough to explain how the hell he wound up in the state that he was in. It didn't help that his symptoms, such as delirium, exhaustion, and headache, were extremely nonspecific. He died in the hospital 4 days later, by which point the doctors had still failed to narrow down a cause for his condition. For some reason, I had it in my mind that he died of rabies. The official cause of death was alternately reported in newspapers as either congestion of the brain or cerebral inflammation. This was usually a polite way to say that somebody died from something unseemly like alcoholism, although we can't be sure what the exact cause of death was. All of Poe's medical records, including his death certificate with the official cause of death, have been lost. Poe's death has remained a mystery for 175 years, but there was one theory presented in the 1870s that periodically gets rediscovered and presented as the true cause of his death. According to the theory, Poe was a victim of cooping. Cooping was a form of election fraud in which gangs would kidnap people off the streets and hold them in a chamber or cellar referred to as the coop, hence cooping. They would then either be bribed with alcohol or beaten, whichever was required to make them comply with their captors. Once it was election day, the cooping gangs would take their victim from polling station to polling station to vote. Often, they would make their victims change clothes multiple times over the course of the day, allowing them to trick election officials and vote in the same location more than once. A number of biographers have presented the election fraud theory to explain Poe's death, and the story persists to this day. To be fair, it certainly makes sense given the facts that we've gone over. However, Poe reportedly didn't have any external injuries to suggest that he had been beaten into compliance. The cooping gang couldn't punch him in the face or anything, and that would make election officials immediately recognize him as the guy with two black eyes wearing a different shirt. But severe beatings to the body likely would have left visible bruises. While the cooping story is possible, it's also possible that Poe died from other causes and just happened to do so on election day, in someone else's clothes. Other suggested causes of death range from alcoholism to carbon monoxide poisoning to syphilis to rabies. There we go. Unfortunately, since the medical records no longer exist, we may never have an answer. In 1947, the Washington Post ran an article about Stalin that contained a story from his days as the Commissar of Munitions. One day, there was a meeting of all the high-ranking commissars to discuss what to do about the famine that was ravaging Ukraine. When one of the other commissars began to speak about the tragedy and read of the death toll, which was in the millions, Stalin interrupted him and said, "If one man dies of hunger, that is a tragedy. If millions die, that's only statistics." The quote showed Stalin's callous nature and disregard for human life, and it has been repeated countless times in the decades that followed its original printing in that 1947 newspaper. I know the quote, I didn't have an idea it came from Stalin, or allegedly Stalin, but the story that was printed, it never happened. To start, Stalin never served as Commissar of Munitions. Only 3 people ever held that position, all of whom were under Stalin. But, more importantly, the quote predates its attribution to Stalin. The earliest example of the quote in a form similar to this goes back to a semi-monthly anarchist magazine out of California called The Blast. In a 1916 issue, the magazine said that there was more pathos in the death of one New York waif from hunger than from 1 million deaths from famine in China, going on to explain that suffering could only be understood on a personal level, not on a great scale. There are also variations of the quote going back to as early as the 1700s, though in different forms. In 1759, a work called Death, a Poetic Essay, Barbie Porteous wrote, "One murder made a villain, millions a hero." Though this was expressing a different sentiment than the quote attributed to Stalin, it still highlighted how death was perceived differently depending on the number of victims. The Knights Templar were a Catholic missionary organization from medieval times. They were founded in 1118 to defend pilgrims visiting Jerusalem, and originally the organization was less than a dozen knights. Once they were officially endorsed by the Catholic Church, however, the Knights Templar quickly grew to anywhere from 15,000 to 20,000 men. Only about 10% of them were actually knights, though. In addition to being one of the most elite fighting forces in Christendom, they also functioned as a sort of medieval bank for nobility and monarchs. A ton of wealth, land, and trust. This allowed them to lend large sums of money, safely transfer money across national borders, and hold deposits for anyone that wanted to safeguard their wealth. But that sort of power and influence inevitably corrupts, and the Knights Templar were corrupted by demonic influences. They began worshipping the goat deity Baphomet as a demonic idol, amongst other acts of heresy like spitting on the cross. Eventually, the organization disappeared from the spotlight, instead becoming a shadowy cult that maintained considerable influence. Well, that's how the story is often portrayed as ending, anyway, with the Knights Templar being the subject of all sorts of conspiracies over the centuries. In reality, however, all that happened was that their banking division made a poor investment in the form of King Philip IV of France. By the early 1300s, King Philip was deeply in debt to the Knights Templar, who had been lending him considerable sums of money to fund his war against England. When a man that had been kicked out of the Templars was arrested and facing criminal charges, Philip used that as an opportunity to paint the Templars as a criminal organization. On the morning of October 13, 1307, Philip had the Grand Master of the Knights Templar arrested, along with scores of other members. They were beaten and tortured into giving false confessions, and it was within those false confessions that their connection to Baphomet first appeared. Even though many people at the time doubted the veracity of the confessions, I mean, they were tortured. The sudden dissolution of one of Europe's most powerful organizations with no clear explanation led to centuries of rumors and speculation being spread as fact. Shakespeare has been considered by many to be the greatest writer of all time for centuries now. But in the mid-1800s, when his work was receiving this level of praise for the first time, a theory was put forth. Shakespeare couldn't have been the true author of the plays. Simply put, he was too poor and uncultured to possibly be such a genius. The question of Shakespeare's authorship has persisted, and while it is generally regarded as a fringe conspiracy theory, supporters of the theory have gone to great efforts to spread the idea as fact as far and wide as they possibly can. There are scores of possible authors that have been proposed instead, such as Sir Francis Bacon and the 17th Earl of Oxford. The common thread is that they were all generally aristocrats who couldn't attach their names to something so pedestrian as popular theatre. As widespread as this theory is, though, there's no contemporary evidence to really support it. Shakespeare's authorship wasn't called into question by contemporary sources, and there isn't anything about his life to suggest that his identity would have been used as a front by another author. That said, Shakespeare didn't write all of his plays alone. Theatres needed a constant flow of new material for their audiences, so it was common for writers to collaborate on plays, kind of like a writer's room for a network drama. Sometimes Shakespeare collaborated with others while writing, and sometimes other writers would read his completed work and make revisions. This happened primarily at the beginning of his career, and again at the end. While some of the plays that were collaborative efforts and who the other writers involved were is known, there is debate over how many of the plays involved other writers and how many Shakespeare wrote entirely on his own. Captain James Cook was a British Royal Navy officer and explorer, best known for being the first European to visit Hawaii and the east coast of Australia. He first made landfall on the islands of Kauai and Niihau in January 1778, after which he and his two ships left in search of the Northwest Passage. Spoiler alert, they didn't find it. That November, Cook returned to the islands and stopped at Maui before docking at Kealakea on Hawaii in January. There he was greeted by 10,000 Hawaiians who believed he was the god Lono. Some of the crew suspected that the Hawaiians thought Cook was a deity, though confirmation of that fact didn't come until many years later. Regardless, the mistaken identity was due to the coincidental timing of Cook's landing in Hawaii coinciding with the Makahiki, a harvest festival and series of ceremonies dedicated to Lono, the god of agriculture, among other things. After a few weeks, it was finally time for Cook and his crew to leave, though relations with the Hawaiians were already strained. One of the reasons for this was that the Makahiki ceremonies had ended, so why would Lono still have been there? The Hawaiians were beginning to question whether or not Cook really was a god. Once Cook left the island, he ran into a storm that severely damaged his ship, forcing him to return to the island and take a smaller cutter to shore. But Lono was supposed to be able to control the winds, so his ship being so easily wrecked by a storm should have been impossible. With the Hawaiians now fully delusioned, some of them stole the boat that he'd taken to shore. Cook attempted to kidnap the king to get his boat back, though this was impossible since the boat had already been burned. The Hawaiians were just after the boat's iron nails. All hell broke out, and Cook was eventually killed. When Cook's crew came to the island to request the return of their captain's remains, their request was granted, but they were not given a complete body as expected. Instead, they received his skull, hands, and some bones with charred flesh. Their immediate reaction was that the Hawaiians had eaten Cook, and when they asked the priests, they received a sort of non-answer rather than a direct denial. As such, they stuck with their assumption, and the story that Cook was eaten by cannibals was written about in newspapers and taught in schools for well over a century. The reality was far less sinister. Even though he wasn't a god, it was clear to the Hawaiians that Cook was still someone important, as he commanded 2 large ships. It was tradition for the bones of high-ranking people to be collected and buried in a casket, as they believed a man's power was stored in his bones. Some of the body had been cooked so that the bones could be more easily removed for the traditional Hawaiian burial. So while it's not true that Cook's corpse was desecrated by Hawaiian cannibals, the Hawaiians do still hold an annual celebration called Happy Death of Captain Cook Day as a way to thank Cook for introducing gonorrhea, syphilis, and tuberculosis to their islands. Shortly after the American Civil War, people in the former Confederate states began creating what became known as the Lost Cause narrative. The idea was basically that the South was fighting a noble and just war, but that they were doomed from the start against the larger and industrialized power of the North. However, this narrative contained a lot of myths and revisionist history that is still believed by many today as fact. Most notably, Southerners argued that the war had been fought over economic factors, northern aggression, and states' rights. Not only did they claim that the war wasn't over slavery, but that slavery would have disappeared on its own in the South anyway. However, all of the historical documents written by the Confederate States, including the Declaration of Causes of Seceding States, made it explicitly clear that slavery was the reason that they wanted to secede from the Union. One of the most notable examples came from the cornerstone speech delivered by the Vice President of the Confederate States of America just weeks after the Civil War began. Quote, "Our new government's foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth." Moral truth, huh? So while you could try to argue that the war was about states' rights insofar as they demanded the right to own slaves, it's hard to deny the true cause of the Civil War when the entire Confederacy was saying the quiet part out loud. Richard I of England, better known generally as Richard the Lionheart, is remembered as being a noble and chivalrous ruler. It certainly helps that he and his rival in the Third Crusade, Saladin, had mutual respect for one another. In fact, both Richard and Saladin were admired by Christians and Muslims alike because of how highly they spoke of one another, despite being on opposite sides of a war. Richard was also unusual for his role as a warrior king. Not only was he a skilled tactician capable of commanding his military, but he was famed for his personal fighting prowess as well. He was not the first ruler to personally excel at combat, but he was romanticized as being the ideal version of a knight and king when such a combination was a distant memory in the minds of Europeans and when chivalric values were on the rise. Oh yes, and the fact that his name was changed from Richard the Lion to Richard the Lionheart immediately following his death probably helped his image as well, as it emphasized his courage rather than his ferocity. However, the vast majority of stories about Richard being the living embodiment of chivalry were just medieval propaganda that really just ignored reality. Yeah, Richard was a great tactician and individual warrior, but he was also excessively cruel. One of the most famous examples took place after Richard's victory at the city of Acre. Richard took 2,700 Muslims as prisoners. These weren't members of the opposing army, they were primarily poor civilians that had failed to escape the city in time. Richard and Saladin negotiated a monetary ransom to be paid in 3 installments as well as an exchange of prisoners. When the first payment was made, Richard was upset that some of the specific prisoners he wanted back had not been included in the first exchange. So he broke off their original deal and tried to negotiate a new one. 9 days after initially taking Acre, Richard decided that Saladin, who had already made his first ransom payment in good faith, was delaying too long in their negotiations. He marched the prisoners to the top of a hill that was in full view of Saladin's army and had all of them decapitated one by one, including women and children, after which they were disemboweled. Even by the standards of the 12th century, this was horrific and inexcusable. It was also the type of thing that medieval historians don't like to talk about, as they felt a more selective biography of Richard would serve society better. In 1761, the children's song "Ah, vous direz maman" was published for the first time. In 1806, the Jane Taylor poem "The Star" was printed as lyrics to that tune to give us the famous lullaby "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." And as everyone knows, the original melody was written by a 5-year-old Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Except it wasn't. though there are a number of true elements to the story. The original song was indeed published when Mozart was 5 years old, and by that age he was already composing music. However, the first hint that Mozart wasn't the original composer would be that it was a French children's song with a French title. Mozart did learn to speak French, something he picked up while traveling, but he didn't begin traveling until the age of 6. More importantly, while the song was first published in 1761, it dates back to at least 1740, 16 years before Mozart was even born. However, while Mozart didn't write the original melody at the age of 25, he did compose his 12 variations on À vous diriger maman. But to claim he was the original composer of the song would be like saying that Vanilla Ice wrote Under Pressure or Vitamin C wrote Pachelbel's Canon in D. Emperor Nero is famous for his cruelty and his persecution of Christians. It is even speculated that the number of the beast, as defined in the Book of Revelations, was chosen for being the value of Nero's name using Hebrew gematria. Among the stories of Christian persecution by Nero is that he regularly used Christians as torches to light his garden at night. The victims would be tied to posts covered in pitch and then set ablaze to provide light for his evening garden parties. But it is unlikely that this happened on a regular basis, if at all. When the Great Fire of Rome broke out in 64 AD, people suspected Nero of being responsible for the fire. In order to shift blame away from himself, he used Christians as a scapegoat. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, some of the Christians held responsible for the Great Fire of Rome were executed by being burned alive. It's worth noting, however, that Tacitus would have been 8 years old at the time and not living in Rome. There are no first-hand accounts of the event taking place, and much like with Caligula, a lot of historians had reason to paint Nero in a particularly negative light. That said, even if Tacitus's account is correct, this would have been an isolated incident and form of public execution. The modern story says that Nero regularly used Christians as torches while entertaining guests, but there's no evidence suggesting that this really happened. After all, there weren't even that many Christians yet, as the Gospels weren't written until after Nero's death, so finding a steady supply of them to light his garden with would have been impractical, if nothing else. In 1456, the Christian city of Belgrade was under siege by the Ottoman Empire for the second time in as many decades. The siege happened to coincide with the appearance of Halley's Comet. I think it's actually pronounced Halley's Comet, but everyone pronounces it Halley's Comet, so I'm just going to go with that. Like Mount Everest is the dude it's named after was Everest, but everyone calls it Everest. So sometimes you just go with the flow. Don't have a go at me in the comments. I mean, you can if you want to, but not about this. Or about this if you want to. I don't mind, whatever. Saying it's like I read them, which I do for my sins. Something that Pope Calixtus saw as a bad omen for the Christian defenders of Belgrade. In response to this omen, he did what any reasonable person would have done. He issued a papal bull ordering special prayers for the city's protection, the ringing of bells to chase the comet away, and excommunicated Halley's Comet.
Excommunicado, in effect, 20 minutes.
This story has remained a popular bit of weird history for centuries, and some museums still include this story in their displays about Halley's Comet. But, as funny as the thought may be, the excommunication of a comet doesn't make any sense. Excommunication is a way for the Pope to expel someone from the Catholic Church, something that would only happen if Halley's Comet had previously been baptized. Even if the average person didn't fully understand the rules surrounding excommunication, surely the Pope would have. In fact, while Calixtus did issue a papal bull calling for special prayers for Belgrade and for bells to be rung at midday to aid in those prayers, the document makes absolutely no mention of the comet. When Calixtus's posthumous biography was written by Bartolomeo Platina in 1475, he attributed the bull directly to the comet's appearance, despite no evidence or documents supporting this. The passage by Platina was then deliberately exaggerated and embellished by Renaissance historians who enjoyed mocking superstitious beliefs of the Middle Ages, leading to the excommunication story. I also enjoy mocking superstitious beliefs. I'll be good in the Renaissance. The Codex Gigas, or Giant Book, is the largest extant medieval manuscript in the world. It's 3 feet tall, over 1.5 feet wide, so over 3 feet when opened, and 9 inches thick. And the story of its creation is as legendary as the book itself. In the 13th century, the Benedictine monk Herman the Recluse was sentenced to immurement for breaking his monastic vows. This was a form of punishment. I know what it is, it's horrible, where you wall someone up into a room with no exits. It's punishment usually reserved for monks or nuns who broke their vow of celibacy. Since this was effectively a torturous death sentence, Herman made a deal with the abbot to try and save his life. He offered to create a book containing all of the world's knowledge in exchange for his freedom, which the abbot accepted. But there was a catch. In order to earn his freedom, the abbot gave Herman just one night to complete the book. Realizing that this was an inhuman task, Herman sold his soul to the devil in exchange for the superhuman ability to complete the entire tome in a single night. I wonder why this is fake. Herman commemorated his deal with the devil by dedicating a full page of the giant book to a drawing of the devil. Obviously, this story didn't happen, but the existence of the Codex Gigas has remained a mystery for centuries. Nobody knows who created it or why, but the uniformity of the text suggests the entire book was written by a single person. It's estimated that completing the text and all of the illustrations would have taken 25 years of dedicated work, which makes the uniformity of the writing even more remarkable. Nothing in the penmanship indicates there was ever a decline in ability from age or illness, which helped spawn the legend that it might have been written in a single night. The Library of Alexandria was once the storehouse for all of the world's knowledge, or at least all of the world's knowledge that the Greeks were aware of, and then it was gone. According to the most commonly told version of events, Julius Caesar burned the library down by accident during the siege of Alexandria. He set fire to Egyptian ships that were docked in the port, but the fire spread and burned down neighboring buildings, including the library. However, while this is usually described as the end of the Library of Alexandria, it was not fully burned to the ground. In fact, the library itself may not have actually been burned at all. The first source to claim that the library was destroyed in the fire was Plutarch, who wrote about it over a century later. More contemporary accounts said that only nearby houses were burned, with one stating the warehouses of books caught fire without explicitly mentioning the library itself. Although little is known about the library after the siege of Alexandria, it's recorded that Emperor Claudius, who would have been emperor when Plutarch was born, built an extension to the library. There are references to the library in the 2nd century AD as well, indicating that it was not yet destroyed. Rather than the library being destroyed in a single catastrophic event, it appears to have instead been the victim of gradual decline. Alexandria's reputation for scholarly endeavors diminished over time, so libraries in other cities became more prestigious than the Library of Alexandria. There were even additional libraries built within the city of Alexandria, and it's possible the Great Library's contents were dispersed among these other libraries, making it more of a network rather than a singular structure. Of course, the library's now completely gone, with not even ruins of the original building remaining, so it was clearly destroyed at some point. However, it was not destroyed by Caesar, and it may have already been abandoned and unused by the time the physical building was eventually destroyed. It's hard to imagine such a thing existing in 2025, but back in the olden days, there used to be something known as a slow news day. Information traveled slower and not much important stuff was happening all the time. But newspapers still had to come out every day and they needed to print something. Nowadays, there's dead space in papers, or on TV news is filled by human interest stories and other such fluff pieces. But there was once a time when it was popular to print total fiction as if it were reality. The most famous example of this was the 1938 War of the Worlds broadcast that we covered in the previous episode on this topic, but over a century earlier, there was another newspaper hoax of extraterrestrial origin. In 1835, the New York newspaper The Sun, which was considered a reputable paper, printed what they claimed was a 6-part series being reprinted from the Edinburgh Current regarding observations of life on the moon. According to the story, a new telescope, the largest the world had ever seen, had been transported from England to South Africa to make observations of the moon. The telescope lens was 24 feet in diameter and the whole thing weighed 7 tons, making it unlike anything the world had seen. The newspaper chronicles the observations of the moon's surface using this new telescope, which included trees, rivers, bison, tiny little zebras, unicorns — my daughter would love that — and humanoid figures with bat wings who built temples of worship on the moon. Unfortunately, the series was only able to run for 6 issues because at some point the telescope was inadvertently pointed at the sun and the massive lens acted as a burning glass, burning down the entire observatory and destroying the telescope. Whoops-a-daisy. Did you point at the sun, John, for f***'s sake? It took weeks before the story was discovered to be a hoax, but even then the newspaper refused to print a retraction until over a year after the story was originally published. But by the time the story was retracted, it had already achieved its goal. The Sun had seen a massive increase of sales, and they eventually became the most successful newspaper in New York. Speaking of the media making up or exaggerating stories just to increase circulation, there was the 1920 interview of Thomas Edison by American Magazine. In the article, Edison was quoted as saying, "I have been at work for some time, building an apparatus to see if it is possible for personalities which have left this earth to communicate with us." He went on to say that he was in the process of constructing the device and he hoped it would be completed in the next few months. Unsurprisingly, the media went wild over Edison's invention of what they dubbed the Edison spirit phone. And as years passed, the stories became more elaborate. In 1933, 2 years after Edison's death, Modern Mechanics magazine published a detailed account of an experiment by Edison and a few other scientists in a secret lab in which they attempted to record the voices of the dead. Edison's device didn't work, which is why the magazine claimed nobody had heard about the experiment before. Of course, the real reason nobody had heard about the experiment is because it wasn't real. It is believed that Edison genuinely made the statements that appeared in American Magazine, though some have speculated that he was meaning it as a joke. Regardless, despite all the years of reporting claiming that Edison's spirit phone could arrive at any moment, he never even attempted to build such a device. The 2015 discovery of a lost chapter of Edison's journal showed that this was a topic he was interested in, as it detailed his thoughts on the afterlife and pondered scientific methods by which communication with the dead might be possible, but this was merely a thought experiment. Edison may have found the idea fascinating, but there is no evidence that he ever attempted to make it a reality. He'd be wasting his time. Media is always better when it's based on a true story, or at the very least when the authors claim it was based on a true story, even if the end result is so far removed from the actual events that it's just a work of fiction.
I'm not saying that because based on a true story will sell more tickets.
Still, the idea that something is based on a true story just makes the stakes feel higher, because there at least are allegedly real people's lives being affected. It's no surprise then that people often try to attribute works of fiction as being based on real events, which is precisely what happened with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And to be fair, it certainly sounds plausible. Giovanni Aldini was an Italian physicist and nephew of Luigi Galvani, from whom we get the word galvanism, by the way. Aldini experimented using electricity on animal carcasses to see how they interacted. He started with frogs and moved up to larger animals like deer, causing the bodies to move or at least twitch by introducing electrical currents. Science back in the day. In 1803, he was demonstrating this principle in London. At the same time, a notorious murderer, George Foster, happened to be executed. The Murder Act of 1751 mandated that anyone executed for murder be publicly dissected, but in lieu of dissection, Aldini was given permission to perform his electrical experiments on Foster's corpse for the public. He applied electricity to various parts of Foster's body, a crowd looking on with a combination of excitement and terror as Foster's jaw snapped shut, his face began to grimace, and one of his eyes opened. Aldini was even able to get Foster's body to raise its right hand and move its legs. The connection to Frankenstein seems obvious, which is why this is often reported as the true story behind Shelley's book. However, Shelley was only 5 years old when this happened, so it's unlikely she had first-hand knowledge of this experiment. More importantly, she said nothing about Aldini or Forster in the introduction to her novel. She wrote that the idea came to her the night before writing it while having a conversation with Percy Shelley and Lord Byron on topics including galvanism and whether or not a corpse could be reanimated. She also specifically mentioned being inspired by the scientific ideas of Erasmus Darwin. It stands to reason that were Aldini's experiment the direct inspiration for her novel, she would have mentioned that as well. By the time she wrote her novel, there was already a strong public belief that electricity played a role in life and death, so the similarities to the real-life experiment were likely just a coincidence. There is also no mention of Aldini or Forster in any of Shelley's writing, including private letters and journals. While the parallels between Frankenstein and Aldini's experiment are striking, it seems Shelley's inspiration came from broader scientific ideas of the day rather than being based on specific knowledge of Aldini's demonstration. The Count of Saint-Germain was a guy who lived in the 1700s, and despite being such a fixture in high society with friends like Casanova, Voltaire, and Mozart, pretty much nothing is known about the Count. Nobody knows his real name or where he was from, particularly because at least 90% of things he said were just total bull. But unlike your average compulsive liar, the Count was actually good at stuff. He composed music, wrote books, and was described by Voltaire as a man who does not die and who knows everything. Voltaire was not being poetic by referring to the Count as a man who does not die either. He He was merely parroting the Count's own claim that he was 500 years old. According to the legend, created by the Count himself, of course, he had used alchemy to discover the secret of immortality and eternal youth. But even before becoming immortal, he had lived as famous people throughout history, and he claimed to have memories of those past lives. But, immortality ain't real, so the Count died on February the 27th, 1784, presumably of pneumonia, and presumably, somewhere between the ages of 88 and 92. Or maybe that's just what they want you to think. There are many people who believed the Count's claims of immortality, and there are countless stories of him showing up after his death. There are centuries worth of photos, including from the present day, all claiming to reveal the Count showing up in various places throughout history. It's also said that he spent time living in New Orleans in the early 20th century under the name Jacques Saint-Germain, although the New Orleans legend said that his immortality came from being a vampire, not from alchemy. Of course, that's just a legend, and most of the alleged photographic evidence of the Count reappearing after his death has either been staged, doctored, or misinterpreted. The story of the Count of Saint-Germain remains popular, but it is no more real than the lies he told during his lifetime. To be fair, though, what better way to honor one of history's most prolific liars than by making up stories about him? In 1165, the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos received a letter that claimed to be from a monarch in Asia. He spoke of his palace made of gems and gold, that he owned a large kingdom stretching from Persia to China, and that his kingdom was essentially a utopia with plenty of wealth for all. The letter was signed John Christian, Sovereign and Lord of Lords. This unexpected letter was seen as quite the boon for Europeans. It was the era of the Crusades, and the idea of a Christian ally in the East gave people hope for defeating Muslims. The letter was taken seriously enough that the Crusaders went in search of Prester John and his kingdom, while others eagerly awaited his arrival on the battlefield. In 1177, 12 years after the first letter arrived, Pope Alexander III even sent a letter to Prester John as a reply to the original letter received by Komnenos. That letter was to be delivered by Philip, Prester John's physician. Needless to say, Philip was a dirty liar, and there is nothing else in the historical record about him, so he was probably just your run-of-the-mill con man. The search for Prester John continued for almost 600 years, but unsurprisingly, there was no Christian utopia hiding anywhere in Asia. While the letter that Komnenos received was real, in that it was a tangible object that genuinely existed, the contents of the letter were very much not real. Based on modern analysis, the letter contained a combination of the geographic information that was known to Europeans at the time and myths about Asia to concoct a fantasy kingdom. It was a hoax designed to increase morale and give Christians hope that they could be victorious in the Crusades. The unknown author probably meant well, but between a letter from the Pope, centuries of searching in earnest for the Asian kingdom, and an increasing mythology surrounding Prester John, clearly the entire thing got away from the author. There are two things that immediately come to mind when it comes to Henry VIII: executions and multiple wives. Henry had 6 wives, mostly in rapid succession. Of the 5 times he remarried, 3 of those marriages took place less than a month after his previous marriage had ended, with his second wedding taking place just 5 days after his first wife died. However, between his third and fourth wives, Jane Seymour and Anne of Cleves, there was a 3-year gap. Because of the unusually long break between marriages, there's a popular story that Henry had a 7th secret wife in between Jane and Anne. This theory of a 7th wife has become extremely popular on TikTok, of all places in recent years. Henry had tried, but obviously failed, to remove Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard from the historical record, and it's claimed that with his 7th wife, he was actually successful in doing so. And yet, despite Henry eliminating his 7th wife from history, TikTokers are happy to tell you who it was. One of the people claimed to have been Henry's 7th wife was Catherine Willoughby. It's true that Catherine and Henry were friends, and that Henry was quite interested in her. There were even rumours at the time that he planned to make her his 7th wife after Catherine Parr, rumours that members of his court took so seriously they informed foreign nations to expect a new queen. But Henry died before he got the chance to marry her. As for that 3-year gap between his marriages to Jane Seymour and Anne of Cleves, it's reported that Henry would really have enjoyed to have married Catherine at that time. The only problem was that she was no longer Catherine Willoughby, she was Catherine Brandon, Duchess of Suffolk and wife of Henry's best friend Charles Brandon. It's possible he waited so long to remarry because he hoped that Charles would just die already, but Charles wasn't so courteous. The other name that shows up for a seventh wife for Henry is Lady Mabel. Unfortunately, it's not clear who that's supposed to refer to. The only Mabels that seem to be associated with Henry were Mabel Brown, Countess of Kildare, who was the daughter of a friend of Henry's. But this Mabel was only 11 when Henry died, which should rule her out as a wife. The other was Mabel Brigg, a woman who was executed for treason for fasting in an attempt to kill Henry. She also wouldn't make sense as a candidate of Henry's wife, so the only way there could have been a secret Queen Mabel is if Henry really did erase her from the historical record entirely. Though that would again beg the question of how people on TikTok somehow wound up with this information. Have you ever noticed how some days it just rains blood? Probably not, because it's relatively rare and a localized occurrence, apparently. Still, the earliest record of blood rain dates back to Homer's Iliad in the 8th century BC. So this has been going on for thousands of years, apparently. And for thousands of years, the explanation for this phenomenon was that it was literally raining blood. This was seen as being a bad omen. No shit. But there was rarely any attempts to explain how or why it was happening. Any explanations that did exist always involved the supernatural, such as Homer claiming that Zeus made it rain blood to warn that a military would be slaughtered in battle. These sorts of explanations were generally accepted without question, with little attempt at scientific explanation. The first attempt at explaining blood rain through science was the hypothesis that large amounts of blood spilled on the battlefield ran into a river or other water supply, and from there it evaporated and became rain. Unfortunately, this idea was based on misunderstood science combined with the false belief that the rain genuinely was blood. It wasn't until the 17th century that people understood the rain was merely tinted red, and they began searching for explanations as to why. Since then, a couple of different mechanisms for red-tinted rain have been identified. One cause is the rain mixing with large amounts of dust particles containing high concentrations of iron oxide. The other, isolated from the red rain of Carrier in 1957, was algae spores that had mixed with the rain. While red-tinted rain is a real but rare phenomena, the thousands of years of reports of it literally raining blood were factually incorrect. On the bright side, it may never have rained blood, but it still does rain frogs somewhere in the world every few years. A lot of European explorers are credited with the various discoveries in the New World, but Juan Ponce de Leon is famous for being the first European documented to make landfall in the continental United States when he discovered the island, Florida. A couple of decades after Ponce de Leon died, people figured out that Florida was part of a large continent rather than an island, but it's not surprising that sailors traveling from the Bahamas would see the Florida Peninsula and assume it was just another island. And as everyone knows, the reason Ponce de Leon discovered Florida because he was searching for the Fountain of Youth. The original story, written by the Spanish historian Oviedo, said that Ponce de Leon had been told about the restorative waters by Caribbean natives, and so he went searching for them. Since myths about such waters already existed in Europe, the story was later changed to state that Ponce de Leon was seeking the Fountain of Youth from the outset, and that was the entire purpose of his voyage. In reality, there have been reports of undiscovered islands to the northwest of Hispaniola, and Ferdinand II sent Ponce de Leon there to find them. Ponce de Leon's motivation wasn't a quest for immortality, it was that the contract with Ferdinand II declared that he would be governor for life of any islands that he discovered. The Fountain of Youth story was entirely concocted by Oviedo and later repeated by other historians, even those who doubted its veracity, until it was accepted as fact. In 1776, famed economist and philosopher Adam Smith published his book The Wealth of Nations. In this book, he described the origins of money and how it was a natural evolution of the barter system. Before currency was invented, markets operated on a barter system whereby people exchanged their surplus goods for whatever items they needed. A farmer with extra grain could trade it to a butcher with extra meat or a blacksmith in exchange for new tools. However, this system required what Smith called the double coincidence of wants. You could only trade your olives for chickens if the person that had chickens also wanted olives. This led to people stockpiling items they believed nobody would turn down in trade, things like salt or metals. These universally accepted commodities became a form of currency, which then gave way to coins and paper currency. The whole thing makes a lot of logical sense, which is why Smith's work was repeated as fact for centuries and is still believed by most people today. The only problem with this version of events is that Smith just pulled everything we said out of his arse. There is no historical evidence to support this theory, and there has never been a barter economy in which some form of currency or standardization for valuing items didn't already exist. Barter did happen before the invention of money, but it was usually one-off exchanges between traveling strangers or enemy tribes. It was never the basis for an economy. Early economies were actually based on gift-giving and reciprocity rather than barter. People wouldn't exchange grain for meat, they would simply give people grain with the hope and/or expectation that those people would give them things in return. There was no specific value assigned to anything, people just provided what they could. This worked well for small communities, but as communities grew, the gift-giving systems became more structured. Rather than general and vague agreements of, I owe you one when someone gave you a gift, it became, I owe you something roughly of equivalent value to 10 bushels of grain. And if the gift was large enough, like a fully built canoe, it might take until the next generation of a family to give back something of similar value. As a result, these gift-giving economies created ways to record credit and debts to one another, and it was from these credit systems that currency evolved as a way to store value. Ironically, not only did currency not evolve from the barter system, you could argue that the barter system evolved from the use of currency. The only times throughout history in which we've ever seen a full-scale barter economy have been when a system of currency collapsed, like after the Russian Civil War or Zimbabwe's hyperinflation. Elizabeth Bathory is famous as the most prolific serial killer of all time. She is alleged to have tortured and murdered over 600 people during her lifetime, most of these supposed victims being peasants, as their disappearances wouldn't have triggered an investigation. And even if there had been an investigation, it wouldn't have necessarily been illegal. While this sort of treatment of peasants by the aristocracy was generally frowned upon, there was no law against it. It wasn't until she began preying on daughters of the lesser gentry that Elizabeth got in trouble with the law. But once she was under investigation, hundreds of witnesses came forward to describe her horrible acts. Some of them even described dead and dying girls that were found on Elizabeth's property after her arrest. More and more stories kept coming out, with one of the most popular being that Elizabeth bathed in the blood of virgins to retain her youth. For centuries, this was all treated as fact, and it wasn't until the 1980s that historians began to investigate whether the rumors about Elizabeth were true or not. The story about bathing in virgin blood almost certainly wasn't, as it didn't appear until a century after her death. As for whether or not she was a serial killer, that part's less clear. Some historians believe that everything was a politically motivated witch hunt because Elizabeth's considerable wealth, land, and influence was considered a threat. They also argue that the witness accounts were all coerced, often by torture, and that none of the witnesses claimed to see any torture or murder firsthand. Others believed that Elizabeth was a cruel and violent murderer, but that her victim count and some of the details are highly exaggerated. But while the truth about her murderous ways may not yet be agreed upon, one thing both sides do agree on is that there is no evidence that she ever bathed in virgin blood. Of course, Elizabeth was convicted and confined to her home, unable to source fresh virgin blood. She died just 3 years into a house arrest, so maybe her death was proof enough that she required the blood of virgins to keep her young. Or maybe it was just a mean rumor about someone people already hated. And that's your 50. Thanks for watching.